the centuries, Malta has accommodated a diverse array of governing powers. The Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Moors, Normans, Sicilians, Spanish, the Knights of St. John, and most recently, the French and the British, have all ruled the island for a period of time during the course of its colorful history. As a result, modern Malta is an eclectic blend of ethnic and cultural heritages. But the identity of the earliest inhabitants of the island is shrouded in mystery, because just like the megalith builders of Cusco, they seemingly disappeared overnight without a trace.
Although located in two different hemispheres, Cusco and Malta are surprisingly similar in a few very intriguing ways. First, the Church of Rome has a prominent and long-standing presence in both. Second, there is a hidden network of ancient underground structures and tunnels in both. And third, both are home to large Cyclopean megaliths. The megaliths in Malta are said to be the oldest freestanding structures on Earth. Some of these structures were built to the same scale as the walls of Sacsayhuaman in Cusco and display many of the same engineering techniques. But because they were constructed with limestone, which is considerably softer than granite and andesite, they are much more eroded. Close proximity to the sea has also exposed the stones to a constant blast of corrosive salty air for thousands of years. What's fascinating is that in the mid-16th century, while the Spaniards were looking on the walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru for the first time and walking through the ruins of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, the first excavations of the megaliths on Malta were beginning, and the very same conclusions were being drawn by the explorers in both hemispheres. These were all structures built by an extinct race of antediluvian giants, which is exactly what the ancients have been telling us for thousands of years.
The ancients believed that the megaliths found on the islands of Malta were built by a race of giants. In fact, here at the Gigantes temples on the island of Gozo, close to the mainland island of Malta, there's this UNESCO sign that says the name Gigantea derives from the word Gigant, Maltese for giant, as Gozatins used to believe the temples were built by a race of giants.
We're in the Interpretation Center at Gigantea and Gozo, where you have a number of legends from all over the world displayed here, including Stonehenge, which the ancients thought was built by Merlin, but not alone. He had help from giants to shift those huge blocks of stone. Here in Gozo, Gigantea, which comes from the word giant, the place of giants, was actually built this time not by a man or Merlin, but by a woman who had a child and would carry the child along with her on her jobs carrying huge blocks of stone. Incidentally, her name was Samsuna, so we even know her name.
The ancients often encrypted secret knowledge in the form of myths that were easily remembered and passed down from one generation to the next. Gigantea was obviously not built by a single giant woman, but the details of the story provide clues to the true identity and nature of the builders. The most obvious clue is her name, Samson, which indicates supernatural strength.
What's important to note about the megalithic blocks used in the construction of these sites here in Malta is that many of them are fragmented. They're fragmented now, but you have to imagine these blocks as solid pieces at one time. These were solid blocks of limestone, and you can see where they're fragmented and where they've chipped off. Those aren't separate blocks. These were solid one-piece blocks that were used as the material for building in these structures. Looking at this temple complex, I'm reminded of the walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, which are very, very similar to this structure here, to what we see in this structure here. If this were not limestone, if this were andesite, or if this were a harder stone, they would probably be very smooth and fit together so tightly that you couldn't pass a blade between them, just like we see in Peru. And what that suggests is something that conventional historians and archaeologists can't accept, that there was once a common global race, very likely of giants, that were building megaliths all over the earth in a very similar fashion.
As in every case around the world, after the megalith builders disappeared from Malta, consecutive cultures of lesser technological skill occupied the vacant edifices they left behind and attempted to repair them using smaller stones, usually held together with mortar. Archaeologists often ignore this obvious fact and credit the primitive latecomers with the building of the impressive structures they merely inhabited and refurbished. Aside from the monumental task of cutting, carrying, and lifting the massive stones into place, these ancient master builders were also assembling them into circular dome configurations, which requires an extremely high degree of mathematical precision and is much more difficult to accomplish than building traditional square or rectangular structures.
It is important to note that in the age before the flood of Noah, the Mediterranean may not have existed as an inland sea, and therefore what we presently know as Mediterranean islands, such as Malta, may very well have been the most elevated regions of the once dry land that is now immersed in the waters of the Atlantic. In light of this plausible contingency, we should not view the megaliths on the island of Malta as an isolated phenomenon. It is very likely that many more of these cyclopean structures were once present all throughout the Mediterranean basin before it was flooded. Furthermore, because of the presence of these megaliths, according to our research, we should expect to find an extensive network of subterranean complexes connected by what might be designated as the Northern Hemisphere's version of the Shinkana.
Just like in the Altiplano and everywhere else on Earth where megaliths are present, what's above the ground is not nearly as impressive as what's below it, and Malta is no exception. It is well known that there is a vast maze of tunnels, caverns, and catacombs burrowed deep into the limestone bedrock beneath the island. In fact, during World War II, as the Axis forces were unleashing one of the most brutal and prolonged bombing campaigns in history, many of these tunnels and caverns were used by the Maltese people and Allied forces for shelter and for the storage of munitions and other vital supplies. Numerous legends have surfaced over the years concerning strange entities, including giants inhabiting the hollows of the subterranean world, especially relating to Malta's most famous ancient underground complex, the Hypogeum.
We're getting ready to go into the Hypogeum, which is a very famous underground tunnel system. More than a tunnel system, it's underground chambers that represent what's on the surface here in Malta, the megaliths that are on the surface. The same sort of chambers and megalithic architecture was carved out of the limestone in the ground. So this is the entrance to the Hypogeum. It's just basically under the street, underneath the buildings.
The Hypogeum is a multi-level underground complex that was carved entirely out of solid rock. It was discovered by accident in 1902 when workers digging a well broke through its upper level. The trilithon doorways and dome-like chambers of the complex mirror the cyclopean architecture of the megaliths on the surface and demonstrate a highly advanced level of engineering skill. It is estimated that over 2,000 tons of stone was removed to create its subterranean chambers. The most famous of these chambers is known as the Oracle Room because of its unique acoustic properties. Any sound generated in the Oracle Room is carried throughout the entire complex and vibrates through the walls. At one time, a large megalithic structure stood directly above the entrance to the Hypogeum. It is believed that even more of these underground complexes may exist beneath the other megaliths on the island.
Access into the Hypogeum is very restricted. You're not allowed to carry anything in with you, and you're certainly not allowed to film or take pictures. Even the historical narrative is carefully controlled. Before you can descend into the complex, you have to view a video presentation which asserts, rather ridiculously, that a group of primitive Stone Age farmers, using only obsidian chisels and deer antlers, were the builders of the Hypogeum. When finally I descended into the complex, I was immediately struck with how haunting the atmosphere was. Apart from the natural darkness, there is a palpable metaphysical darkness lingering in the atmosphere down there. It's not at all like a cave or a tunnel. It's much more like a crypt, a place of esoteric power.
When its chambers were first opened in 1903, the bones of 7,000 human beings were discovered inside the Hypogeum. Among the bones were some very unusual skeletons, at least 6 of which had strangely shaped elongated skulls. All of the bones were eventually removed from the Hypogeum and placed in storage, and the 6 elongated skulls were put on public display in a museum in Malta's capital of Valletta until 1985, when they mysteriously disappeared along with many of the other bones.
Elongated skulls have been discovered all over the earth. Many of these peculiar skulls are not just abnormally shaped, they are anatomically different than ordinary human skulls. The official policy concerning them is that every single one, and there are thousands, is merely the result of artificial cranial deformation, such as cradle headboarding and binding, which is still common among diverse indigenous groups around the world. Whereas artificial cranial deformation is definitely capable of molding the cranium into conical forms, it does not add additional mass to the skull. It only reshapes it. However, many of the most pronounced elongated skulls are much larger and heavier than ordinary human skulls and possess more cranial capacity, which in layman's terms means more brains. These phenotypic distinctions are very likely the expression of genetic deviation. In other words, these skulls may have belonged to a divergent human-like species. The implications of such a staggering proposition are astronomical and, frankly, dangerous to the Darwinian establishment, which rejects any proposition that challenges their codified doctrine. However, it is a fact that newborn babies, as well as fetuses possessing elongated skulls, have been discovered and documented on various occasions, which signifies that a genetic component is involved in at least some of these specimens.
The elongated skull phenomenon is not a new discovery. Archaeologists have known about it for centuries. They have known, for example, that in ancient Egypt, the elongation of the skull was a mark of royalty and prestige, and even accentuated in the depictions of the royal line, such as in the case of King Akhenaten, and even more so in the depictions of his daughters.
It is possible that the tiaras, headdresses, and crowns of not only Egyptian royalty, but many other ruling factions besides, may in fact be implying an intentional imitation of some venerated hybrid race. It is logical in my mind to conclude that all of these many diverse and unacquainted cultures around the world were artificially elongating their skulls as an act of veneration to emulate the gods, or the offspring of the gods, the hybrid bloodline, so to speak.
The Bible plainly tells us that non-human hybrid entities exist in the world even after the flood of Noah. Aside from the giants, the Rephaim that we encounter on numerous occasions throughout the scripture, strange human-animal hybrid creatures also appear, such as the lion-like men of Moab mentioned in the book of 2 Samuel. These hybrids were genetically alien to the human race. And I believe that some of them still lurk in the remote places of the earth, including the underground labyrinth beneath Malta. Sightings of both giant and pygmy creatures have been reported in the tunnels and caverns under the island, and more than a few people have gone missing while exploring them, including a class of students along with their teachers. In August of 1940, National Geographic magazine featured an article entitled "Wanderers Awheel in Malta." The article detailed the underground world that honeycombed the bedrock of the island and states that the government had to close the entrances to the tunnels after school children and their teachers became lost in the labyrinth while on a study tour and never returned.
Years ago, one could walk underground from one end of Malta to the other, but all entrances were closed by the government because of tragedy. On a sightseeing trip comparable to a nature study tour in our own schools, a number of elementary school children and their teachers descended into the tunneled maze and did not return. For weeks, mothers declared that they had heard wailing and screaming from underground, but numerous excavations and searching parties brought no trace of the lost souls. After 3 weeks, they were finally given up for dead.
We can only guess what happened to these children and their teachers, but I know from military sources that very evil and frightening entities are still routinely encountered under the earth. And as one general informed me, his special operations teams go down into the bowels of the earth to kill the things that go bump in the night.
The similarities between Malta and Cusco are extraordinary. The megaliths, the secret subterranean world, missing artifacts, and at the center of it all, the Church of Rome. It is well known that Jesuit priests, along with other church clergy and affiliates, were the primary excavators of the megaliths on the island, including the hypogeum. It is also well known that not all of their discoveries were made public. At least one of the cathedrals in Malta was intentionally raised over the foundations of an important megalithic construction, which is rumored to have another hypogeum-like complex buried beneath it.
We're in Shokia, one of the larger villages of Gozo, with the parish church right behind me. Well, around 100 years ago, there was a Jesuit priest excavating. His name was Manuel Magri. He was one of our foremost amateur archaeologists, but he was doing the job on scientific lines. He excavated the hypogeum in Malta. He did Shokia Temple as well. We still have the report in the museums department. And Shokia Temple is now disappeared. You cannot see it. The church that you see behind me, the Catholic parish church of the village, is built over the site of Shokia Neolithic Temple, which is now all completely gone. The Catholic Church often built its churches on top of previous pagan temples or other religious structures, or on ley lines. In this case, Shokia's parish church, finished in the 1950s, is actually built on top. It has smothered and removed any evidence of Shokia Temple.
Just like in Cusco, the Church of Rome has intentionally occupied strategic archaeological sites in Malta and has had special access to both the megalithic ruins on the surface of the island and the subterranean labyrinth beneath it for centuries. There is no question in my mind that more underground complexes like the hypogeum exist, but are hidden from the eyes of the public. Who knows what sort of artifacts have been removed from these mysterious chambers and secreted away to the Vatican vaults under St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. One thing is for certain, the operatives of the Holy See who have access to those vaults know full well that Stone Age farmers did not build the megaliths on Malta or anywhere else in the world.
So who built the megaliths? This is the elusive question that vexes everyone. Even some of the university-trained archaeologists with whom I've spoken admit privately that Stone Age and Bronze Age civilizations simply were not in possession of the knowledge or the tools to construct these cyclopean edifices, and not only construct them, but perfectly align them with specific constellations of stars based on precise astrological calibrations. It is clear that whoever built them had an advanced comprehension of the cosmos. It is also clear that at some point in the distant past, the knowledge of cyclopean megalithic masonry abruptly disappeared from the earth. This is a resounding indication that something catastrophic obliterated the old world. Knowledge such as this, so profitable to mankind, is not simply discarded or forgotten. Surely this superior and universal building technique that not only withstands extreme seismic convulsions, but also survives the tempests of time, would have been worthy of preservation and further developed by consecutive civilizations. The question of who exactly built the megaliths is much less relevant than the question of when they were built. And it is our contention that they belonged to that empire of the gods, which was decimated in the waters of the Great Flood. So in other words, they were constructed during a time when not only giants walked the earth, but a host of other hybrid sentient entities, all utilizing the forbidden knowledge of the Watchers.
Malta holds many more mysteries than we had time to thoroughly explore. The famous cart ruts engraved into the bedrock all over the island are an enigma in themselves and could provide proof of prehistoric machine technology that may have been used in the transportation of large stones. We know that many of the megaliths were once covered beneath layers of sediment. We can only wonder how many more are still buried under the soils of the landscape or sunken under the waters of the Mediterranean. The island of Malta has provided us with another piece of the puzzle concerning the true legends of our forbidden prehistoric past.
The Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Hebrews, the Indians, the Chinese, Japanese, and Tibetans, the Greeks, the Romans, the Inca, Aztec, and Maya, as well as hundreds of other cultures besides, all record in song, verse, sacred script, and oral tradition a time long ago when the gods descended from heaven to dwell among men and mingle their seed with the human race until a great cataclysm destroyed their world. Many of these ancient records also prophesy a time when the gods will return to resurrect their empire and reinsert themselves into the human genome.